Hello and welcome to the BGCP Disassembled podcast, the official podcast for the Big Glasgow Comic Page, where we talk about the latest comics, movies, television, and other pieces of nerd culture. I'm your host for today's episode, Massimo Costelli, joined by my co-host, of course, as always, the lovely Daniel.
Hello.
And on today's interview special, because we're continuing to do these, we are joined by a writer whose credits include Captain America, King in Black, Dynamite's James Bond, and Queen of Bad Dreams for Vault, with working for various projects on Marvel and for Vault Comics. We'd like to welcome to the show the phenomenal Danny Lohr.
How you doing? It's still so weird to hear my list of credits. I'm still at the point where I'm like, I did that. Oh gosh.
Oh man, I mean, it must be surreal because over the past year you've shot into stardom, and could you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, just so they know who you are?
Yeah, it's actually super weird to think of, in particular, about it all kind of happening, especially in the past year and a half, because one of my first big book events was literally 2 days before quarantine. I had been part of a great YA anthology called Phoenix First Must Burn, and it had been my first ever event at the Strand, right? We're on a panel and it's super dope. And then I was supposed to go to Emerald City, I think the next week, or TLA, I don't remember which, because both were very close to each other, and I had actually taken time off, and I was like, I'm gonna travel for the first time in a million years, and then everything shut down. So there was a few months there that as a writer, I had done stuff at that point, Bond was already up and going, Queen of Bad Dreams, but
Phenomenal book, by the way. I read that this morning. It's great. Queen of Bad Dreams.
Thank you.
It's great.
I love the final product of that. It still means so much whenever I look at it. But it was this real moment of fear, because there's always that fear that oh, you're starting to talk to editors and get your foot through the door at and then quarantine hits, and then it was that kind of pen down moment, and everyone who I was talking to, and everyone was super sweet, and and everything, but it's that comics went silent for 3 months, and kind of what does that mean? It's a very real and reasonable fear of what's going to happen with the abyss of quarantine. So I feel really fortunate to have had this work out so far for me. I had a plan at the beginning of 2020, beginning of 2021, that's when I'm going to stop retail and I'm going to go full time. And then quarantine happened. It's I guess you're full time freelance now, technically. But it's been really exciting and, really wild when I just think of, I'm one of those people that always, whenever something great happens to someone, I'm like, cool, let's build a time machine and figure out how to go back and tell you 10 years ago that this was going to happen.
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking about that a lot, with COVID, and just going, wow, there was a point in my life that it didn't occur to me that you could do this as a career. I knew writers wrote comics. I was always my goal was to be a prose writer, except for that misinformed time where I didn't understand journalism as a child, and I was I'm going to be Lois Lane. And then I learned that journalism is not what I wanted to be.
Well, I was going to say, I'm doing journalism at university at the moment, so fingers crossed I don't come to that same realization as well in the middle of my course.
Too late for you.
Luckily, I came to that at a young age, but the first Halloween costume I picked for myself was Lois Lane. I was dedicated.
Nice.
And then my wife became a journalist and copy editor. So I was does that make me Superman? Did I marry Lois? That rocks. But yeah, just kind of looking back and being oh wow, right? I can do this as a career, and then I've gotten to work on so many of my dream projects just within the first year and a half of me ever doing license work, and that's wild, you know, that like to wake up and get at times, you know, at least one or two emails a month being like, "Hey, would you be interested in getting paid for doing this dream you've had since you were like a kid?" And me being like, "I guess. I mean, sure."
You're paying me for this? Hang on.
You know, so it's been a wild and scary but really fulfilling ride, and I hope to keep impressing people enough that they keep paying me to do this, because I'm going to be doing it either way. It's just whether or not I get to get paid for it.
So you kind of spoke there, Dan, about the last year or so, and like kind of getting your name out there and getting to work on more high profile projects. But where did comic writing start for you? Was there a moment where you were like, oh, I can write comic books, or was it always there? Did you always have these kind of ideas, or how did that come about?
I was always a writer. Like even before I knew how to like really read and write, I would like stack up my mom's magazines, like fashion magazines, and just like flip through them. And the way that I would occupy myself would be to challenge myself to tell a tale from one end of the magazine to the other using all like the ads. Like that was just, I would sit there with a pile as big as myself because I'm a small like small fetus child and just do this for hours. Um, but like for a long time, like I thought it was going to be just prose. Like I'm fortunate enough to be doing both right now, which is really cool. Um, I still don't know how I came to this realization, but I never hit the stress of if you're going to be a writer, you're going to be broke. Somehow I knew that, and I don't know what conversation that was. Uh, but I always like I was in school and I understood that like cool, what I'm working on now in school is figuring out what my day job will be so
Mm-hmm.
that I can write, you know. Um which you know like I guess is nice because I didn't have the pressure of like that sudden realization of, oh, those first years at least are going to be real tough.
Mm-hmm.
um but for me, like, and I got into comics when I was real little. Like I started with books of magic when I was like, I don't like 10 or younger probably, because it was like in the public library. um but it didn't occur to me that this was like an industry you could break into for a very very long time. I had no concept of how to do that. And then I was really fortunate when I started working at Forbidden Planet in New York City, you know, meeting, you know, uh, my comic soulmate and best friend, Vida Ayala, and then also working with like Matt Rosenberg and Tyler Boss, as well as, you know, being fortunate enough to meet a lot of industry people through being both, you know, random, you know, showing up and like regulars. So I got to learn a lot about the industry through there.
Yeah.
You know, like seeing it's not every day that you get to watch multiple people break in different ways into the comics industry. And then those people also being people who have seen your personal writing, and so they trust you not to embarrass them. You know, like that's kind of like an also like an important thing too. I think a lot of people don't realize that um yeah, you've got to be able to write, but you've also got to be the sort of person that like can be introduced to people and editors,
Yeah.
you know, and being like, I can leave you with this editor for a little bit and I don't have to worry about what you're going to say. And I learned, you know, I'm sure that I've said buck wild things in my life, because in case you don't notice, I babble, but
It's perfect for the show.
but like but I spent a lot of time learning not just from like what they were doing, but but hearing and watching other people
Yeah.
both, you know, have good and bad interactions. I'm the sort of person that, as much as I talk a lot, when I get into new groups of friends, especially within like writing or different careers that I'm interested in, I like just sitting and listening.
Yeah.
um, you know, once you ask me a question, I'll keep talking. But if you don't, I really enjoy that, and I really enjoy, you know, learning the different etiquettes, or like, you know, on a social level, but then also like the technical stuff, you know. Some of my favorite conversations have just been listening to both editors and letterers, you know, just talking about what makes scripts easier to read, you know? And so I was really fortunate to come into comics having already listened to those conversations, which is like, that doesn't happen, you know? There's so much that we learn on the job, you know? And that's why I'm really big about like when anyone asks about those technical things, I'm like, let me tell you what so and so told me.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you as well. Was that you're kind of obviously like more well known as a writer now, but you obviously have credits as an editor as well, and
Mhm,
also most recently I've seen you've been a sensitivity reader for Giga or
mhm,
one of Alex
mhm.
Pattonell's book, and I just wonder what's the process like of being like an editor or sensitivity reader, and then having to give like almost criticism for people maybe to or like advice to change certain things or kind of like take little bits of the story and edit them. Like, what's that like having to like give your opinion on other people's work in some capacity?
Uh, so I think it's a little bit different with sensitivity writing. So like reading. So I'll like put that slightly to the side. But like to start with editing, the hardest thing is learning it's not about your opinion. It's about getting to understand what the client wants. And definition of client changes on project. A lot of times since I'm doing freelance editing, the client is uh the writer or the the artist, the team that's hiring me. But it can also be, if you're looking at like license work or something, the client is a combination, right? It is what the company needs, what the license needs to appeal to its audience, to stay in line with what's there, with what's been decided, but also understanding what the team wants to express and then figuring out how best to help them do it.
Yeah.
Now sometimes that means a hard criticism of, I know what you're trying to do here. You're not doing it. And this is why. So let's talk about whether you want to change what you want to do or whether you want to change how you're doing it.
So you're not
Um,
sitting there with like a like almost a machete cleaving through pages of scripts, like, no,
yeah,
this is
you don't want, yeah, you don't want to. Like sometimes you will do it in the form of like an edit letter. Like I will sit there and I will go, cool, I think that this script needs line edit. So I'll go in and, like give comments on every line or like give suggestions for dialogue alterations. And sometimes I'll be like, I don't think that's going to be useful to you, you know, because I think that where the core is something that we want to talk about fully structural. And I don't want to dig into the different scenes until we have a discussion about what you're trying to do, because it may turn out what I think would be a good suggestion for, line by line doesn't work because it does, because we're having a fundamental misunderstanding of what you're trying to do, like one of the things I try to do as an editor is just like a small thing for me, so that it doesn't become about my opinion, is that if I see something that I think is not landing because of a certain reason, I will never give just one example of how it can be fixed. I try to give like two or three, and part of that is because there's that subconscious, if there's only one example, part of you wants to say that's the right way to go, right? When it's not really about that, one of the funniest notes I ever got was when I had my mom read a first draft of a novel, and it was like, it's like space military, like, they're war all the time, and her response was, what if they had a dog? And it made no sense. It was literally the wildest note that she could possibly give, but what was really being stated was, I needed I needed something that was like, in all of the gray area stuff, I wanted to connect to something that was a little, that was simpler emotionally, that you were sitting there going, "Oh, I care about this and I have no conflicted feelings about what this character, this entity is doing. So if something happens directed to this character, I know how to feel, right?"
So it's all about the implicit rather than the explicit kind of
Right.
suggestions and stuff like that of
Yeah,
yeah.
so as an editor, I don't want to give suggestions to say do it like this. I want to give suggestions in terms of, in case, like you're struggling to see the perspective of my note, these are things that I think would do that, Meanwhile, sensitivity reading, it's still not quite your opinion, but it is couched in I worry that if you're doing this as someone who represents this group, this could be harmful.
I mean,
you
you did a
know?
great job with Giga because like I felt like the characters always had some very true voice. Obviously, Pat Liddell, phenomenal writer. We've had him on the show
Yeah.
as well. But I think definitely having, and I even say because I've reviewed the first two issues, it's like having you on as a sensitivity reader was like a masterstroke because it is one
I
of those things
mean,
of like it's like having like that opinion as you said that like that ability to have someone who has lived those experiences in some capacity
yeah.
be able to give their ideas on it.
And like and part of that as a sensitivity reader. So one of the things about that is that a lot of drama that comes with, and you see it more in prose obviously because there's more conversation about sensitivity readers there than with comics, but the understanding that all the sensitivity reader can do is give suggestions and opinions and gut feelings, and it is really up, the the genius really sparks when the team is open to hearing it and processing it, right? So in prose you sometimes see discussions where a sensitivity reader, for example, is like thrown to the wolves because it's like, oh no, there was nothing wrong with my book, I had a sensitivity reader, and like that reader's like, cool, it'd be real unprofessional for me to list all the ways in which you didn't listen to me, like don't or like a sensitivity reader can only speak from their perspective, you know. It may be a thing where there's a myriad, you know, uh possibilities for opinions within a marginalized community about something, right? So you have to make the decision to like do A or B, but you may be in a situation where you're always going you always have the potential of harming someone, right? And that's true even if you're writing from your own perspective, right? And what's really great about working with Alex and working with like Adrian as an editor is that they're incredibly open to those discussions, you
Yeah.
know. um
That's
is
pretty
that
valuable as a writer, surely, that kind of perspective.
oh yeah, like it just you know, when we were working, you know, on the first couple of issues of Giga, and just being like, here's where I think, you know, there might be concern, you know, and there were statements where I was like, here, I think that no matter what you do in this situation, you know, like, um these are the ways that I think people might want to react, and then it's on you to decide whether or not it's worth it, you know. And then we got on the phone and we had these really great discussions about what you know, what Alex's intentions were, you know, where Alex wanted to go. And then we, you know, some of the times we then threw out what my, you know, initial gut feeling note was, you know, because it's like, oh, okay, you're trying to do something different here. Well, let's think about the, you know, the way that is least harmful, you know. And Alex is always very very thoughtful about that. I've been fortunate enough to call him a friend for a few years now, and which also makes it easier, like for some friendships it makes it harder to be a sensitivity reader because you're like, oh god, I got to say this to my friend. But with Alex is someone who do no harm is really at the forefront of his processes. So it's very easy to just say, "Hey, man, I think that you're doing this," because for the most part, I'm like, I know you didn't really mean to do that, you know, like, you know,
Yeah.
like if there was an issue, and then he jumps on it and he's like, "Yeah, no, let's fix this immediately." Um, and like he's always that dude, you know, like I, you know, not to gas him up, but I have upon many occasions referred to him as one of the smartest friends I think I have in comics, and one of the most thoughtful.
Nice. Well, that was fun enough. Our next question is, who are your inspirations in the industry? I don't know if you would count Alex as one of those, but just anyone else that's kind of helped you along the way and kind of helped you become the writer you are.
I mean, I've got to start with Vita. Obviously, I think that I've learned so much, both about being a writer, but you know, as being a person in a community, in with my friendship with Vita, you know. And that's huge in all writing. I think that it's undervalued sometimes for writers because we talk in prose because we think about it as such like an isolated work. But you know, I think, you know, you still have editors, you still have, you know, publishing teams, all of that. And I think that the writers that do the best in comics in general are those who remember that they're not the only creator on the team. And I learned a lot about how to communicate that through Vita, like um, how to, have discussions about how things should be expressed, or butting heads even, or just being excited about each other's work, but not as if, what the writer says goes, because I think that a lot of people accidentally end up doing that. Just because, that's kind of something that as writers, uh that's the image, the solitary writer who makes their own world, and like
Yeah.
that's never fully the case, like um
Well, you mean you hear about these creative teams, and you realise when you look at the list of credits, you realise how many moving parts there are and how much goes into producing these things. So,
yeah, and how some of the best work comes because of that.
yeah,
It's not just that, this, an artist was given a brilliant script and so it was going to be good. It's like, no, because that artist and those letterers and those colorists and those editors were brilliant as well, and everyone, put their heads together to create something great. Like,
Mhm.
I frequently script a page and then go, but, since you know how shapes work and I'm just here for the dialogue, if you want to ignore all of this because you have a better way of approaching it, do it, and I will make my dialogue work. Like, as long as the basic idea is coming through, like, I bow to everyone else's expertise, because that's how I learn to be a better writer, right?
yeah.
So
I
did,
don't know if there's ever an issue that I write that I don't learn a little something from the team. Which, like, so there's obviously that. I I'm like, almost like every time I like look at people's work, I'm like, I want to learn from this, and like, um I think that there's a lot of editors I learned a lot from, over time at different companies, just in terms of writing creator owned and writing licensed stuff,
Mhm.
and then writing licensed stuff like Bond versus licensed stuff like, Blade or Champions, for example. They're all
Sure.
very different, because what you, especially the first issues of anything like those, is such a different thing to wrangle, because expectations, exposition for new readers, exposition for readers who read the other stuff but it's been a while so they forgot, how to
yeah,
present teams.
I was gonna say that's what we're gonna kind of ask you about as well. We had we have it into the question list here. It's the idea of like how does it work with that creative control of you say kind of wrangling stuff that is licensed property for stuff like Marvel, say when you were doing like Ironheart or like other kind of licensed properties versus when you do your creative own stuff. Is there like a very almost distinct boundary between them, or is it like they kind of go back and forth a little bit between how you approach them?
um I think that more so at certain things, like the very beginning of a story, there are tighter boundaries and things, but that's more because when you're working with established characters, there's different things expected, right? Like, I'm sure that if I ever did, you know, a sequel to a creator owned work of mine, that came back, in some ways, at least the first few pages would be almost a little more similar to writing licensed work than, a full story, because you're introducing characters in different ways.
Mhm.
The characters on the page mean something different. I can have, John Constantine, Kamala Khan, and Dahir all say or do the same thing in one page, but everyone reads those 3 pages differently because they mean something different, right? And that's something you have to deeply keep in mind, right?
Sure.
That was kind of some of the fun for, like, my DC Pride short, sitting there and being like, this is a character that we're just starting to know, Jess, that they are newer to the universe, but on the flip side, um, Flash means something, so you're writing a story with a newer character that we don't have as much information about, but on the flip side, we have so much information about because of the legacy, right?
Mhm.
Um, and but on a certain level, and this is kind of where having having a resume both in prose and comics helps me, is that I have enough short story prose stuff that when people are looking, like, for examples of my writing, I feel like my voice is pretty obvious. Like, my voice is pretty obvious. The kind of stuff I want to do is pretty obvious. Like, if they, bring me on for something, like, and I want to pitch something that, has a bit more, social commentary about marginalization, that's not a surprise. Like,
Yeah.
it's not like, it's like I've given you all the clues.
And as as
um
as that always, obviously you're saying it's expected, but is it always welcomed? Is it always a conversation that you have before you start writing, or how does it
for
work?
me it has been. And that again is in part because when people at like, I've done something very specific where, like, obviously Queen of Bad Dreams, Quarter Killer, I have those comic pieces that, like, it's pretty obvious the topics that I want to, speak about. But then also I kind of do a thing that I always make sure to have um some of my less subtle pro shorts as writing samples. So for example, some of my stories, like the first short story I ever published, like, period, was in Fire magazine, like all black magazine, and it's literally about a black exorcist being profiled by a magazine in a world where, like, demons, where, like, white people have started making pacts with demons for possession, for power, right? And so it's the last, like, it's the last profile of the last working exorcist, while laws being put into place banning exorcism, right?
Wow, that's a
And
really.
and it's basic. So, like, and then I have another story that's literally just like a cab ride as this young werewolf is like, shit, it's almost full moon, and like I'm cutting my time real short. But it's very clearly about, like, what happens to rich kids who are werewolves versus broke kids who are
Right.
werewolves, and, like, uh as the taxi driver has no clue there's a werewolf in the background, so he's just spitting the most awful stuff, like, he's speaking and you're like, that's a nightmare, this is like the world's worst taxi ride. And, like, one of the things that I was doing very early in my career is when people wanted writing samples, I would send those too,
Right.
because my logic is, if reading those two pieces turned you off of working with me, then we probably wouldn't be able to make a good story
Yeah.
together.
That's all
Like,
you need to know. Yeah.
yeah. If you read Last Exorcist and Fair, the sort of person you're approaching, right? And going, like, okay, this is what they want to do on a structure. That doesn't mean I don't, like, do fun things. Like, when the DC Pride thing comes out, you'll see, like, it's very lighthearted.
Doesn't always have to be
Um,
serious all the time. It's just, I
yeah,
guess,
but it's just like, even then, in the, lightheartedness of it, like, there's a lot of me in there.
I
A
think that's
lot of
really
me.
cool though. I really appreciate that boldness. Like, just this is me and this is it. And if you want to date, that's that. That's
yeah.
cool.
Yeah. And not everyone has the opportunity to do that, but I was fortunate, again, knowing people in the industry already. So when I'm coming in, I came in with an introduction, and being in, and, like, yes, it was terrifying. I definitely spent, every time someone asked for samples, I was on the phone with Vita, like, what do I send it? What do I do? Oh gosh. Like, it sounds real cocky about me sending these things, but that cockiness came after doing it a bunch of times, being, like, crazy nervous about it.
Right.
Um
Publishers quite
but then
perceptive to like the idea of like want to spread that kind of message or like underlying themes across and like kind of what like see like a publisher like Marvel or like DC as you said, are they quite perspective as like looking at like someone who yourself as a point of view as a person of color and also part of the LGBTQ plus community? Is it kind of like, are they very perceptive into allowing that to be kind of out? And it's a weird one to ask, because obviously
oh,
comics.
I think it makes perfect sense, because I think that over the decades there have been horror stories, right? And
Yeah.
we still hear them today. Um, but I've been really fortunate. Like right now, working with Alana Smith on Champions is like a gift, right? Because there are, you're having these discussions, and we do it in some ways, in some really like silly, wacky ways in Champions, right? But obviously, a story in 2021 about social media and superheroes is not, like there's a point we're getting across, right? And there were times where we were discussing things, and Alana was not only really perceptive to what I wanted to do versus what I was attempting on first drafts, which did not always align, still don't always align, but also what was needed in terms of the overall um, universe, and has been really, really helpful in finding how to say what I want to say. Like, there was never a point really where I felt that the point of notes was to don't say that.
Mm.
It's always how to say it so that it does what you want in this environment. Um, and so that was really fortunate, and it's still like I said, I'm still learning so much, Champions being, my longest like big two kind of project thus far, especially, solo. Um like solo writing. None of this is solo because oh my gosh, Luciano Luciano tells so much story. And I love it. Um I am not naturally I'm a sarcasm funny person. I'm not naturally like a goofy funny person. And
You,
Luciano's art makes like jokes so much easier, and like in a way that I would struggle with a lot more if I didn't have him helming, especially some of those gorgeous action scenes.
um, when you mentioned earlier on about how when you're writing for certain characters, people are going to read them a certain way. When you're writing on these really high-profile characters like Captain America or Riri Williams, does that come with its own set of challenges when you sit down? Is it quite daunting to think, right, this is a line that Steve Rogers is going to say or Riri Williams is going to say, or is it just a story that Danny Lore's telling, the same as any other one?
Um, I think it depends on the character, right? So for me, the second Alana was also the editor on my King in Black. So the
Mhm.
second I started talking with her, um, we kind of nailed what we wanted metaphorically and stuff like that. And maybe getting the exact wording was hard for Steve,
Right.
but like knowing the thing about a Steve story is it for me, at least personally, it is always as much about what he represents for everyone else in the room,
Yeah.
as for himself. So like that was one of the reasons that I was like, let's do something really internal. Like it is very odd to hear all of his internal doubts, but
Mhm.
him balancing like his internal doubts versus what he knows of himself as a symbol, I thought
Yeah.
was a really
Really,
kind of
I
fun.
really enjoyed the way that you tackled that in the book. I really appreciated that. I thought it was really clever and subtle while still being clear enough what you were trying to do. I thought it was, yeah,
Yeah,
really enjoyed that.
and writing Steve like in 2020 is also like a very specific thing, right?
How would you rate a 110-year-old
Because
man?
yeah, but it's also this thing where, especially as someone who is incredibly online all the time, uh the dehumanization of our heroes in the real world is constantly happening. Especially, like as a Black person, and I watch constantly that, the second we decide that someone is a hero, we stop treating them like a person, like as a society. um that the idea that like their internal thoughts don't matter,
Mhm.
that the fact that making these choices hurt doesn't matter, the idea that um I think it was Greg Rucka once said that like he was discussing about how some people had a like struggled to write Steve, right? And it was like the issue is not Steve's personality, right? It's the struggles you put in front of him, right? Like that's what makes the story. You know, he's going to try to do right. Whether he chooses right is different, right?
Yeah.
You know, like so that's a very distinct thing where I wanted to deal with that struggling because I think that that's something we pretend doesn't happen,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it was interesting structuring a story to me where he is continuing to do the heroic thing, but what's happening in his head while he's doing it, and then having Sam and Bucky there, two of the people who deeply understand, you know, not just as superheroes, but as you know, as Caps, you know, like
Yeah.
so they have, you know, Bucky has you know worn his trauma a bit more on his sleeve than the rest, you know,
Yeah.
but the three of them know exactly what it feels like to have that shield and have all of those thoughts that they can express, right? So like that was a very specific thing. And then you know with John Constantine with the DC stuff, I'm just like, this is literally my favorite character of all time. So I'm just gonna keep going until they make me stop stuff. Like with like his voice is not the problem. It's just making sure that like his the way he cons everyone is believable. I think is always a thing. Like his issue is going to be like a structural plot thing for me more so than his voice.
Does that change
'Cause-
on if like if a character say is like so quintessentially American as Captain America, and then changes as you become someone who's more British, and they're like kind of writing with like John Constantine or even James Bond as well. You've written on as well. Is there like a difference between those two? Like
um,
how to write them?
so for me, I just accepted my first draft that I'm gonna have to in the second draft and before lettering hits do a bit of Britishization. But that happens with Steve too. It's just a different manner of speaking, you know. That sometimes in that first draft the voice may be off, but the point is there. Um, and for me, yes, I'm gonna struggle with some Britishizations, but then in my full-fledged obsession with John Constantine in college and being a live journal RPer, I may have spent many weeks studying specifically 80s through 90s British slang. To the point that I used to have just full-fledged documents to like study and take apart his words.
What were some of
Also,
the
I have.
interesting ones you came up with? Like, what were some of the ones that you like really
Oh
stuck out with you
boy.
during that? Just out of interest, because that seems like quite a niche
Oh,
subject.
I'd have to go. I'd have to go back to it, but it's just certain modes of speech. Like, I probably pull most of my stuff. I mean, it saddens me that I don't have a space to write truth anymore, like Delano used to, as a swear because it does not work anymore. But I want to desperately use it at some point. But a lot of times it will be my trick for John is to go back to a couple of my favorite runs. So if I'm losing his voice, I start up the Laughing Magician run from Andy Diggle. Is a big influence on how I write him. Because it is a story with a very solid physical plot, but it is a meta story about who John is. So I find that really easy to go back into. But like, it's not the voice for John. It's how is the sentence he's saying simultaneously helping him right now and will screw him over later. like
Yeah.
with John, it's the double layer because he will accidentally screw himself over 10 times while saving himself in the moment, right? Like, you know, in the same way that like Steve is incredibly thoughtful and measured about what he said, John thinks he's incredibly thoughtful about what he said. You know, where, you know, Riri is a little bit closer to home, except like the science version of my like, you know, literary version. You know, Riri is a bit closer to people I know and what they sound like. What is interesting for me with Riri is the most fun for Riri is the fact that she's a character who's a superhero, but she as a writer, I explicitly get to think about her physical boundaries while writing it. Um,
Yeah.
she is a character who she may initiate a hug with someone, but that is a very particular relationship, you
Mhm.
know? But like whether someone's allowed to touch her, allowed to be in her personal space, and navigating those things and navigating the ways in which she's very particular about her space and her sense of personal safety on an emotional level,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean that she's not a superhero, you know. And so that's a thing that's unique to her, I think, in a lot of ways, because I think that, you know, you look at a Steve or, you know, Superman or any of those characters and you see them as the big, you know, like, oh, when some anyone runs up and hugs them, that's okay, you know. um but it's okay for Riri to not be okay with everyone and still be a hero, you know.
Yeah.
And I really love that. You know, it kind of flies in in Riri in some of the best ways, flies in the face of some of those respectability politics that I think we sometimes see.
Mhm.
You know, she doesn't always have to be on. If she's wearing the suit, then she's on. You
Yeah.
know, like she has put on that, you know, open for business sign, you know, and she can still be a great good person when she's not in the suit, but respect her boundaries.
Yeah.
And I love that, especially as a teenager. Writing a teenage girl who is very aware of her boundaries is nice.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite character to write for, or do you like writing for loads of different folk because they've got their different qualities and things like that?
uh the answer always depends on who I'm writing right now. You know, like right now I'm having a lot of fun with Sam with Nova in particular. I kind of, you know, like I've read it before, but I was, you know, going back and reading his backstory and remembering how immediately I wanted to like pick him up and protect him from like his life. Um and uh but you know, every time I write Kamala trying to cheer someone up or Viv trying to navigate conversation, like they become my favorite.
Yeah.
You know, I have a couple of favorites right now that, you know, redacted, that hopefully I'll be able to share at some point.
Cool.
Um, but then also, I'm in this weird place where, like we were saying earlier, within this past year, I have almost checked off my entire bucket list of characters. It's
Wow.
really weird.
That's
It's
amazing.
really, yeah, it's really weird to have come into comics and immediately be writing all my favorites.
Yeah.
You know, like, or like say Riri, for example, who I had gotten into only a short time before, you know, like being approached for it. But like for me, the Iron Suit was important because like Iron Man was my dad's favorite growing up. So getting
Yeah.
to write like the young black girl in the you know, like in the Iron Suit was
Yeah.
really, you know, a personal a moment for me that meant a lot. Also just anything after, you know, Eve's run of everything is just like, now I both want to play over there, and now I'm also terrified, and now I get to do both.
I was gonna
But
ask, like, see when you have certain like events that happen in Marvel, so such as like the whole Kamala's Law thing that happened, how does that impact on like writing in like an individual story? Like, do you have to bear that in mind, the kind of greater world that exists in the Marvel universe when you're writing?
my run on Champions is very much about the fallout of Outlaws.
Yeah.
Not like it is more, or fallout is wrong. It is the team going, cool, this still exists. We have to switch up how we're dealing with this. And like
It's an
that is the
interesting.
purpose of that book.
It's such an interesting concept, though. The idea that I don't know if Dan, if you've read kind of some of the other stuff that kind of surrounded it, but the
Uh,
whole thing of you can't have an under 23 superhero in the Marvel universe currently,
Mhm.
which is
Yeah, like
incredible.
it's
yeah.
Which, yeah.
and much like many of the heroes in that universe, the debate between the legal law and the moral laws is really prominent, you know? And I think that there is, after Outlaw, a lot of serious and interesting traumas, both internally and externally, that the champions have to deal with, you know? Dealing with their personal relationships to each other and their relationships to the world and this law and what happens after that, right? So like that is really deeply in it. The Ironheart 2020 was interesting because technically it was part of the 2020 event, but it was also during the start of Outlaw. So we also we also had the wildness of technically having two events affect how we did that, which was really kind of fun. Um, I am a person who, I love when you give me free range to do something. I'll be like, all right, but that's how you get. Can I put flamethrowers on Sam's wings? I was like, I don't know if they're gonna let me do this. I literally remember sending the email like, I promise you it won't work. Like, I want to do this and it will fail horribly as a good reason for him never to do it again. But also I love certain restrictions, right? Like I love cool, you have free range to come up with whatever you want, but these characters, or full range, but this law is in place, because then I get to decide, cool, how am I going to interact with that,
Mm.
right? And that's fuel for storytelling. Deciding whether how deeply I want to play with that restriction being noticeable, or how much I want to be like, cool, we'll just, it's just off the table. Or do I want to make the story about that, I love stories that are that successfully are about an absence or an emphasis on something, it doesn't always go well, because sometimes you're just sitting there waxing, nostalgically on the past. And that's not a great story, but characters that are deeply affected, and I think that's why, say for example, John Constantine is like one of my favorites, because he sits there under the shadow of his own mistakes, pretty heavily. But also the world, especially these teenagers and the champions in particular. There is the power fantasy for teen superheroes is different from the power fantasy of adults, right? Like, so with adults, it's the power itself is kind of part of the fantasy, but for teenagers, it's really so much about agency and being able to affect the world around them in a way that a lot of us did not feel like we could as teenagers, that we felt like we were hitting a brick wall over and over again. And their superpowers are like a freedom. It is a way for them to enact that agency. And so, that law in and of is about inflicting, trying to take away that freedom. But then these kids also have the agency to react to that,
Yeah.
to do things, and that's not to say that there aren't teenagers today that aren't doing amazing work. But, a lot of teenagers are are boxed in, either by their circumstances or by the hellhole that is our brains as teenagers, or lack of support from those close to them, and so these teens having these superpowers and having each other just is a great experience to write, because it's like, no, they can make a change. Now, will they trip and fall and, make mistakes? Of course, like they would do that if they were adults, let alone teenagers, does their own personal life, get too wrapped up in the bigger picture? Of course, but even the space to fail in those ways is sometimes more agency than teenagers are given. So I think it's still important.
Yeah, definitely. Um, Well, I think we've kind of took up enough of Danny's time. I was going to start wrapping up, but before we do, I'd like to ask: is there anything you're working on currently that you can tell us about, or is it all just in the pipeline yet to be
It's all
announced?
super secret, hush hush. Oh,
Yeah, I am very fortunate to have some fun redacted stuff that I hope I'll be able to talk about soon. Um, and whenever it does, you'll be like, "Oh, Danny was real serious about that bucket list stuff."
Cool. That's exciting.
same,
You know,
honestly.
like
Yeah.
it's really nice that even the really hard scripts that I'm working on right now are just are fun.
Mhm.
You know, that I'm working on projects that even if I get back a note that's going, I don't think this works at all, I'm like, all right, cool. I now know why it doesn't work, so I'm gonna spend the rest of the day fixing it, and that'll be fun. And that's kind of where I am at right now, and it's nice. And hopefully this will continue.
Nice. And do you have anything else that you'd like to plug, Danny? Just,
Um,
I mean, we can attach your Twitter handle and all that sort of thing if you'd like. If there's anything else that you'd like to point people towards.
so big truth, I am really bad at knowing dates and times and where I am in the world. So I like have to take a minute and be like, what am I working at? What am I doing?
That's okay.
But I think April 21st is the first day for Champions, but it
Cool.
is also, I think, when the physical copy of the Truth and Justice, the John Constantine stuff is collected as well.
Ooh.
Yeah,
Nice.
so and it's also my sister's birthday, so it's like a big day for me.
So much
So
going
that's
on. You're
really
like,
exciting. And you will get, and for the Truth and Justice, there are 2 covers physically, because you get the Doug Braithwaite cover, which is beautiful, and then you also get the variant by Sway, which if you have not seen that yet, is real good. Got both of them understand how important it was to have Papa Midnight real big and pretty on that cover, and I respect it. But yeah, like, so that's kind of what's happening, and I'm very much in the situation where I'm just like, look at me on Twitter over at what is it? What is my Twitter? I've never changed it. I don't know why I forgot about it for a second. Weredogs, WEREDAWGZ. Because I have a bunch of stuff happening right now. And if you're interested in my work as an editor, right now I've edited the most recent online issue of Fireside Magazine. It's a speculative fiction magazine, and so like once a week a story is dropping right now, and it's just some really a really gorgeous collection of stories we got in for that submission, a nice big range, and you should read the magazine anyway because it's always got dope stories. But I'm really proud of the table of contents we're putting together, and there's still I think about half the stories are still dropping now.
Fantastic. That's all super exciting. Danny, thanks again for coming on.
yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for
Really
having
nice.
me.
Been looking forward to this for a while, so I'm really glad we got to do it today.
Yep.
Yeah,
great.
same, and I'd love to do this some more later.
Okay. Well, I'll just.
What we like to hear.
Yeah, I'll just outro us out then. So you guys have been listening to the BGCP Disassembled podcast. You can find us at the Big Glasgow Comic Page website, which is bigglasgowcomicpage.com, I believe. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter with the same name and handle. And obviously, if you're listening to this, you can listen to it through Spotify, Anchor, through Podbean, and also on YouTube as well. So thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great week.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Disassembled. You can find more news and reviews on bigglasgowcomicpage.com. And don't forget, you can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube as BGCP Comic Con. Make sure you also subscribe on your podcast provider of choice for new episodes every week.